Journeys Out of the Body by Robert Monroe. And this is the first of Robert Monroe's books. He actually wrote 3 books. And this is chapter 1, entitled, Not with a Wand Nor Lightly. The following ordinarily would appear in a foreword or preface. It is placed here on the assumption that most readers skip such preliminaries to get to the meat of the matter. In this case, the following is the crux of it all. The primary purposes for the release and publication of the material contained here are 1. That through dissemination as widely as possible, some other human being, perhaps just one, may be saved from the agony and terror of trial and error in an area where there have been no concrete answers, that he may have comfort in the knowledge that others have had the same experiences, that he will recognize in himself the phenomenon and thus avoid the trauma of psychotherapy or, at the worst, mental breakdown and commitment to a mental institution. 2. That tomorrow, or in the years to come, the formal accepted sciences of our culture will expand their horizons, concepts, postulates, and research to open wide the avenues and doorways intimated herein to the great enrichment of man's knowledge and understanding of himself and his complete environment. If one or both of these aims are served, whenever and wherever it may be, this is sufficient reward indeed. The presentation of such material is not designed for any particular scientific group. Rather, the principal attempt is to be as specific as possible in language understandable to scientists and laymen alike, with avoidance of ambiguous generalities. The physicist, chemist, life scientist, psychiatrist, and philosopher may each use more technical or specialized terminology to state the same premise. Such interpretation is expected. It will indicate that the plan of communication is workable, that the plain talk does convey the proper meaning to a wide base rather than to a narrow pinnacle of specialists. It is expected, too, that many interpretations will be contradictory. The most difficult mental process of all is to consider objectively any concept which, if accepted as fact, will toss into discard a lifetime of training and experience. Yet much has already been accepted as fact on far less direct evidence than that presented here, and is now accepted in quotes. It is the hope that the same will apply to the data included here. It is indeed the most difficult mental process of all, this objective consideration business. Once in a lifetime is enough. Let's look for a beginning to this candid report of a highly personal experience. In the spring of 1958, I was living a reasonably normal life with a reasonably normal family because we appreciated nature and quiet. Ours was a country environment. The only unorthodox activity was my experimentation with techniques of data learning during sleep, with myself as the chief subject. The first sign of deviation from the norm took place on a Sunday afternoon. While the rest of the family had gone to church, I conducted an experiment by listening to a particular tape recording of a highly isolated environment. It was a simple attempt to force concentration on a single intelligent signal source, in brackets, oral, with lower signal input from the other senses. degree of retention and recall would indicate the success of the technique. Isolated from other sights and sounds, I listened to the tape. It contained no unusual or stray suggestion. Most significant in retrospect was the strong suggestion to remember and to recall all that took place during the relaxation exercise. The tape ran its course with no unusual result. My recall was thorough and complete because it had been a product of my own efforts and thus familiar to me, perhaps too much so, as no retention and recall of original or new material was possible in my case. The technique would have to be utilized with some other subject. When my family returned, we all had brunch, which consisted of scrambled eggs, bacon, and coffee. Some unimportant controversy occurred at the table, which was not germane to the problem. A little over an hour later, I was seized with a severe iron-hard cramp, which extended across my diaphragm or solar plexus area, just under my rib cage. It was a solid band of unyielding ache. At first, I thought it was some form of food poisoning from brunch. In desperation, I forced myself to regurgitate, but my stomach was empty. Other members of my family who had eaten the same food showed no signs of illness or discomfort. I tried exercising and walking on the assumption that it was a cramped abdominal muscle. It was not appendicitis, as my appendix had been removed. I could breathe properly in spite of the pain, and my heart appeared normal in pulse rate. There was no perspiration or other symptoms whatsoever, just the hard, tense, locked in place rigidity of a band of muscles in the upper abdomen. It occurred to me that perhaps some factor in the recording had caused it. In going over the tape and the written copy from which it had been made, I found nothing unusual. What suggestion there was, I complied with, seeking to relieve any unconscious suggestion that might have been applied. Still, no relief. Perhaps I should have phoned immediately for a doctor. However, it didn't seem that serious, nor did it become any worse. But it didn't get any better either. Finally, we did phone for medical help. All of the local doctors were away or playing golf. From 1:30 in the afternoon until around midnight, the cramp and pain continued. No typical home medication seemed to alleviate it. Sometime after 12, I fell asleep from pure exhaustion. I woke up in the early morning, and the cramp and pain were gone. There was muscle soreness throughout the afflicted area, much as one gets from over-coughing, but no more. What caused the cramp in this area is still unknown. It is mentioned only because it was the first out of the ordinary event, physical or otherwise, that took place. In retrospect, perhaps it was the touch of a magic wand or a sledgehammer, although I didn't know it at the time. Some 3 weeks later, the second major event entered the picture. There had been no further recorded tape experimentation because the suspicion was strong that the cramp was somehow related. Thus, there was nothing that apparently triggered the event. Again, it was a Sunday afternoon and the family had gone to church. I lay down on the couch in the living room for a short nap while the house was quiet. I had just become prone, head to the north, if that had any meaning, when a beam or ray seemed to come out of the sky to the north at about a 30-degree angle from the horizon. It was like being struck by a warm light, only this was daylight, and no beam was visible, if there truly was one. I thought it was sunlight at first, although this was impossible on the north side of the house. The effect when the beam struck my entire body was to cause it to shake violently or vibrate. I was utterly powerless to move. It was as if I were being held in a vice. Shocked and frightened, I forced myself to move. It was like pushing against invisible bonds. As I slowly sat upright on the couch, the shaking and vibration slowly faded away, and I was able to move freely. I stood up and walked around. There had been no loss of consciousness that I was aware of, and the clock showed that only a few seconds had elapsed since I had stretched out on the couch. I had not closed my eyes, and I had seen the room and heard outdoor noises during the entire episode. I looked out the window, especially to the north, although why and what I expected to see, I don't know. Everything looked normal and serene. I went outside for a walk to puzzle over this strange thing that had happened. Within the following 6 weeks, the same peculiar condition manifested itself 9 times. It occurred at different periods and locales, and the only common factor was that it began just after I had lain down for rest or sleep. Whenever it took place, I fought myself to a sitting position, and the shaking faded away. Although my body felt the shaking, I could see no visible evidence that it was doing so. My limited knowledge of medicine envisioned many possibilities as the cause. I thought of epilepsy, but I understood that epileptics had no memory or sensation in such seizures. Furthermore, I understood that epilepsy is hereditary and shows signs at an early age, and neither was evident in my case. Second was the possibility of a brain disorder, such as a tumor or growth. Again, the symptoms were not typical, but this could be it. With trepidation, I went to our longtime family physician, Dr. Richard Gordon, and explained the symptoms. As an internist and diagnostician, he would have had what answers there may have been. He also knew my medical history, such as it was. After a thorough physical, Dr. Gordon suggested that I had been working too hard, that I get more sleep, and take off a little weight. In short, he could find nothing wrong with me physically. He laughed at the possibility of a brain tumor or epilepsy. I took his word for it and returned home, relieved. If there was no physical basis for the phenomenon, I thought it must be hallucinatory, a form of dreaming. Therefore, if the condition came again, I would observe it as objectively as possible. It obliged my coming on that very evening. It began some 2 minutes after I lay down to sleep. This time, I was determined to stay with it and see what happened, rather than fight my way out of it. As I lay there, the feeling surged into my head and swept over my entire body. It was not a shaking, but more of a vibration, steady, unvarying in frequency. It felt much like an electric shock, running through the entire body without the pain involved. Also, the frequency seemed somewhat below the 60-cycle pulsation, perhaps half that rate. Frightened, I stayed with it, trying to remain calm. I could see the room around me, but could hear little above the roaring sound caused by the vibrations. I wondered what would happen next. Nothing happened. After some 5 minutes, the sensation slowly faded away, and I got up feeling perfectly normal. My pulse rate was up, evidently due to the excitement, but no more. With this result, I lost much of my fear of the condition. In the next 4 or 5 occurrences of the vibration, I discovered little more. On one occasion at least, it seemed to develop into a ring of sparks about 2 feet in diameter, with the axis of my body in the center of the ring. I could actually see this ring if I closed my eyes. The ring would start at the head, slowly sweep down to my toes, back to the head, keeping this up in a regular oscillation. The time of the cycles seemed to be some 5 seconds. As the ring passed over each section of my body, I could feel the vibrations, like a band, cutting through that section. When the ring passed over my head, a great roaring surged with it, and I felt the vibrations in my brain. I attempted to study this flaming, electrical seeming ring, but could discover no reason for it, or what it was. All of this remained unknown to my wife and my children. I could see no reason to worry or concern them until something definite was known of it. I did take a friend into my confidence, a well-known psychologist, Dr. Foster Bradshaw. If it had not been for him, I cannot predict where I would be at this time. Perhaps in an institution. I discussed the matter with him, and he was most interested. He suggested it might be some form of hallucination. Like Dr. Gordon, he knew me well. Consequently, he laughed at the concept that I was in the beginning stages of schizophrenia or the like. I asked him what he thought I should do. I shall always remember his answer. Why, there's nothing else you can do but look into it and see what it is, Dr. Bradshaw replied. Anyhow, it doesn't seem that you have much choice. If it happened to me, I would go off into the woods somewhere and keep trying until I found the answer. The difference was that it was happening to me and not to Dr. Bradshaw, and I couldn't afford to go off into the woods, either literally or figuratively. I had a family to support. Among other things, several months passed, and the vibration continued to occur. It almost became boring until late one night when I was lying in bed. Just before sleep, the vibrations came, and I wearily and patiently waited for them to pass away. so that I could go to sleep. As I lay there, my arm was draped over the right side of the bed, fingers just brushing the rug. Idly, I tried to move my fingers, and I found I could scratch the rug. Without thinking or realizing that I could move my fingers during the vibrations, I pushed with the tips of my fingers against the rug. After a moment's resistance, my fingers seemed to penetrate the rug and touch the floor underneath. With mild curiosity, I pushed my hand down further. My fingers went through the floor, and there was the rough upper surface of the ceiling of the room below. I felt around, and there was a small triangular chip of wood, a bent nail, some sawdust. Only mildly interested in this daydream sensation, I pushed my hand still deeper. It went through the first floor ceiling, and I felt as if my whole arm was through the floor. My hand touched water. Without excitement, I splashed the water with my fingers. Suddenly, I became fully aware of the situation. I was wide awake. I could see the moonlit landscape through the window, and I could feel myself lying on the bed, the covers over my body, the pillow under my head, my chest rising and falling as I breathed. The vibrations were still present, but to a lesser degree. Yet, impossibly, my hand was playing in a pool of water, and my arm felt as if it was stuck down through the floor. I was surely wide awake, and the sensation was still there. How could I be awake in all the other respects and still dream that my arm was stuck down through the floor? The vibrations started to fade, and for some reason I thought there was a connection between my arms stuck through the floor and their presence. If they faded away before I got my arm out, the floor might close in and I might lose my arm. Perhaps the vibrations had made a hole in the floor temporarily. I didn't stop to consider the how of it. I yanked my arm out of the floor, pulled it right up on the bed, and the vibrations ended soon after. I got up, turned on the light, and looked at the spot beside the bed. There was no hole in the floor or rug. They were just as they had always been. I looked at my hand, my arm, even looked for the water on my hand. There was none, and my arm seemed perfectly normal. I looked around the room, and my wife was still sleeping on the bed. Nothing seemed amiss. I thought about the hallucination for a long time before I was able to calm down enough to sleep. The next day, I considered actually cutting a hole in the floor to see if what I had felt was there on the subfloor: the triangular chip of wood, the bent nail, the sawdust. At the time, I couldn't see disfiguring the floor because of a wild hallucination. I told Dr. Bradshaw of this episode, and he agreed that it was a rather convincing daydream. He was in favor of cutting the hole in the floor to find out what was there. He introduced me to Dr. Louis Wahlberg, Wolberg, a psychiatrist of note. At a dinner party, I casually mentioned the vibration phenomena to Dr. Wahlberg. He was only politely interested and evidently in no mood for business, for which I couldn't blame him. I didn't have the courage to ask him about the arm in the floor. It was becoming fairly confusing. My environment and personal experience had led me to expect some kind of answers, or at least promising opinions, from modern technology. I had an above-normal scientific, engineering, and also medical background as a layman. Now I was faced with something where answers and even extrapolation was not quickly available. In retrospect, I still cannot envision having dropped the matter entirely at any time. It may be that I could not have done so had I tried. If I thought I faced incongruities at this point, it was because I did not know what yet was to come. Some 4 weeks later, when the vibrations came again, I was duly cautious about attempting to move an arm or a leg. It was late at night, and I was lying in bed before sleep. My wife had fallen asleep beside me. There was a surge that seemed to be in my head. Quickly, the condition spread through my body. It all seemed the same. As I lay there, trying to decide how to analyze the thing in another way, I just happened to think how nice it would be to take a glider up and fly the next afternoon. My hobby at that time. Without considering any consequences, not knowing there would be any, I thought of the pleasure that it would bring. After a moment, I became aware of something pressing against my shoulder. Half curious, I reached back and up to feel what it was. My hand encountered a smooth wall. I moved my hand along the wall, the length of my arm, and it continued smooth and unbroken. My senses fully alert now, I tried to see in the dim light. It was a wall, and I was lying against it with my shoulder. I immediately reasoned that I had gone to sleep and fallen out of bed. I had never done so before, but all sorts of strange things were happening, and falling out of bed was quite possible. Then I looked again. Something was wrong. This wall had no windows, no furniture against it, no doors. It was not a wall in my bedroom, yet somehow it was familiar. Identification came instantly. It wasn't a wall, it was the ceiling. I was floating against the ceiling, bouncing gently with any movement I made. I rolled in the air, startled, and looked down. There, in the dim light below me, was the bed. There were 2 figures lying on the bed. To the right was my wife. Beside her was someone else. Both seemed asleep. This was a strange dream, I thought. I was curious. Whom would I dream to be in bed with my wife? I looked more closely, and the shock was intense. I was the someone on the bed. My reaction was almost instantaneous. Here I was. There was my body. I was dying. This was death, and I wasn't ready to die. Somehow the vibrations were killing me. Desperately, like a diver, I swooped down to the body and dove in. I then felt the bed and the covers, and when I opened my eyes, I was looking at the room from the perspective of my bed. What had happened? Had I truly almost died? My heart was beating rapidly, but not unusually so. I moved my arms and legs. Everything seemed normal. The vibrations had faded away. I got up and I walked around the room. I looked out the window, smoked a cigarette. It was a long time before I had the courage to return to bed, lie down, and try to sleep. The following week, I returned to Dr. Gordon for another physical examination. I didn't tell him the reasons for the visit, but he could see that I was worried. He carefully examined me, ran blood tests, fluoroscopes, electrocardiograms, palpated all cavities, ran urinalysis, and about everything else he could think of. He checked very carefully for indications of brain lesions and asked me many questions related to motor action and various parts of the body. He arranged for an EEG, in brackets, brainwave analysis, which evidently showed no unusual problem. At least, he never reported any to me, and I'm sure he would have. Dr. Gordon gave me some tranquilizers, sent me home with orders to take off weight, smoke less, get more rest, and said that if I had a problem, it was not a physical one. I met with Dr. Bradshaw, my psychologist friend. He was even less helpful and far from sympathetic when I told him the story. He thought I should try to repeat the experiment if I could. I told him I wasn't ready to die. Oh, and I don't think you'll do that, Dr. Bradshaw stated calmly. Some of the fellows who practice yoga in those Eastern religions claim that they can do it whenever they want to. I asked him, do what? Why, get out of the physical body for a while, he replied. They claim that they can go all over the place. You ought to try it. I told him that was ridiculous. Nobody can travel around without their physical body. Well, I wouldn't be too sure, said Dr. Bradshaw calmly. You ought to read something about the Hindus. Did you study any philosophy in college? I said I had, but there was nothing that I could recall about this traveling without the body business. Maybe you didn't have the right philosophy professor. That's what it seems to me. Dr. Bradshaw lit a cigar and then looked at me and said, well, don't be so closed-minded. Try it and find out. As my old philosopher professor said, if you're blind in one eye, turn your head. And if you're blind in both eyes, then open your eyes and listen. I asked what to do if you were deaf too, but I didn't get any reply. Of course, Dr. Bradshaw had every reason to be casual about it. It was happening to me, not to him. I don't know what I would have done without his pragmatic approach and his wonderful sense of humor. It is a debt I shall never be able to repay. The vibrations came and went 6 more times before I got up the courage to try to repeat the experience. When I did, it was anticlimax. It was an anticlimax. With the vibrations in full force, I thought of floating upward, and I did. I smoothly floated up over the bed, and then I willed myself to stop. I did, floating in midair. It was not a bad feeling at all, but I was nervous about falling suddenly. After a few seconds, I thought myself downward, and a moment later, I felt myself in bed again with all the normal physical senses fully operating. Excuse me. There had been no discontinuity in consciousness from the moment I lay down in bed until I got up after the vibrations faded. If it wasn't real, just a hallucination or dream, I was in trouble. I couldn't tell where wakefulness stopped and dreaming began. There are thousands of people in mental institutions who have had just such problems. The second time I attempted to dissociate deliberately, I was successful. Again, I went up to the ceiling height. However, this time I experienced an overwhelmingly strong sexual drive, and I could think of nothing else. Embarrassed and irritated at myself because of my inability to control this tide of emotion, I returned back into my physical body. It wasn't until some 5 episodes later that I discovered the secret of such control. The evident importance of sexuality in the whole subject is so great that it is covered in detail later. At the time, it was an exasperating mental block which held me within the confines of the room where my physical body lay. With no other applicable terminology, I began to call the condition the second state, and the other non-physical body we seem to possess the second body. So far, this terminology fits as well as anything else. It wasn't until the first evidential experience, which could be checked, that I seriously considered these to be anything but daydreams, hallucinations, neurotic aberration, the beginnings of schizophrenia, fantasies caused by self-hypnosis, or worse. The first evidential experience was indeed a sledgehammer blow. If I accepted the data as fact, it struck hard at nearly all of my life experience to that date. My training, my concepts, and my sense of values. Most of all, it shattered my faith in the totality and certainty of our culture's scientific knowledge. I was sure our scientists had all the answers, or most of them. Conversely, if I rejected what was evident to me, if to no one else, then I would also be rejecting what I respected so greatly, that mankind's emancipation and upward struggle depends chiefly upon his translation of the unknown into the known through the use of his intellect and the scientific principle. That was the dilemma. It may have been truly the touch of a magic wand and a gift bestowed. I still didn't know.